discussed Buddhism in one of the earlier podcasts, and I showed you how Buddhism as a philosophy is a part of the Indian tradition. And the term we would want to use here, as is the case in many of the Indian traditions, is a non-theistic religion. I'm using the word religion because there are certain elements of religion like prayers, maybe one patriarch, certain practices, sacred scriptures, and I'm using the term non-theistic because there is no concept of God in these traditions, such as Jainism, Buddhism, or the Charvak in Hinduism. So today in this podcast, I'm going to talk about the very fundamentals of Buddha's philosophy and what does he try to say as a philosopher. As I use the term non-theistic religion, it's very clear that there is no concept of theism, no concept of God. It means Buddha is not attempting the metaphysical questions. Buddha is very practical in his philosophy. At the same time, we must remember one particular thing about Indian philosophical schools, which is that the heart of every school of thought, the idea is nirvana, or the end of suffering. That's what we mean by enlightenment in Indian scenario. That how can we end the human suffering? And when we pursue these paths, we find different schools of Hinduism. Some schools have the idea of God, some don't. And Buddhism certainly doesn't have any idea of God, but still pursues this path where we are trying to address the human suffering and how we can take care of that. So Buddha's philosophy is very pragmatic and addresses the human suffering. And the idea is to put this suffering to an end. And as we read Buddha, we find that he's only interested in acquiring the wisdom necessary to achieve a very substantial and concrete result, which is the end of suffering. So the philosophy of Buddha, it involves a theory about the nature of human existence and how we can escape this suffering. He does not recommend that we simply accept his wisdom as a matter of faith. In fact, he encourages us to actively test them for ourselves in our own experience. But before we talk about the four truths that Buddha mentions, let's just understand what is the idea of self as per Buddha. Buddha makes a very interesting point about the nature of self. As we experience this world in our day-to-day life, most of us feel that we are sitting inside some kind of vehicle and there is a core inside. There is a self inside. But Buddha, he thinks that it's a mistaken conception. In fact, you can see it like David Hume's proposition, where he says that self is just a bundle of transient features. It is constantly changing, constantly evolving. Same goes about Buddha. He makes the same claims. So for example, when we look at a particular tree, particular stone, a mountain, we think we are very much like that, stable, not really changing. There is a core to us. Sure, few things here and there are changing, but the core is really intact. But Buddha challenges this assumption, which is mostly based on our intuition. He asks us to think of ourselves like, let's say, the air, or the water, or the fire. If you look at the fire, how it's burning, it's constantly changing every moment, its shape, how it grows, how it fades, and how eventually it vanishes. According to Buddha, that's what we are, without having any core. It might feel very tempting to believe that there is a central core, but there seems to be none. Especially when you try to find it, where exactly is this core is, where are you located? You will realize there is none. And that's when we enter the four noble truths that Buddha speaks about. And the first one of them is that life is suffering. And we constantly suffer. And if you combine it with the second truth, which is really about the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering is that, as I said, we are transient creatures. There is no central core. But there is something inside us that wants to hold on to this transient world, and we want to pretend there is some constant here. But since we are ignorant of this, we try to cling on to things, to ideas, to external objects, and even to our own identity, most of which we have ourselves constructed, or through some social or cultural patterns we have created this identity, and we just want to hold on to it. So this causes endless suffering, and Buddha says we find ourselves in the trap of endless cycle of rebirths. And to my mind, this rebirth of the idea that Buddha speaks of is not really how we generally perceive it. It's more about going from one stage to another, which is constantly happening, like the fire, like the air. We're constantly evolving, constantly changing. And as we go from one moment to another, we continue to suffer because of our insistence on holding on to things. The third truth is that we can release ourselves from this endless series of suffering. And that is where we need to let go. Surely the idea of having a permanent core, having a permanent identity, the idea of living after you're dead, going to a paradise, all this seems fancy, but this is really the heart of why we suffer, and we should avoid that. And the fourth truth is about the Buddha's way of showing us how we can actually practice this, and how we can overcome all these sufferings, which is really the Buddha's eightfold path is all about. And it tells us about having a right view, having right intentions, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So as you see, Buddha is showing us the way to live a life where we don't suffer, or suffer the least. In fact, in many of the Western philosophers' works, or to some extent Christianity, philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer, you find this idea of how life is really about suffering and how can we best deal with that. In fact, if you read about Sam Harris's ideas of morality and how morality should be or how it is, and he talks about well-being, human well-being. And I would say that's very much influenced by Buddha's ideas or much of the Eastern traditions, where the central focus is on the end of suffering and how we can lead a good life. On the contrary, in much of the Western philosophy, the emphasis is on truth. So all the philosophical schools and the logic that pursues the path of truth, while in Eastern traditions, Indian traditions, you find much emphasis on nirvana, enlightenment, or the end of suffering, whatever you want to call it. But this has a lot of practical significance for all of us, and especially dealing with mental health challenges and leading a good life, healthy life in today's world. Buddha has a lot to teach. And the most important aspect of his philosophy, what I find, is the focus on yourself, which is very much the central idea of spirituality, that you focus on yourself, not just the external world. If there are troubles around you, if there are things that are beyond your control, something is making you anxious, the thoughts of past and the future, all of this can only impact you if you allow it, if your mind is not very well trained. But if you work on yourself, you work on your actions, your thoughts, and you have right mindfulness and right concentration, then you can really overcome these challenges. And that's the reason so much of Buddhist philosophy goes with the meditation. It's not just simple words, but there are certain methods that you have to follow along with that in order to really understand it, really feel it, and test it for yourself. But this ancient wisdom can be of really good help even in the 21st century.